There is an oft-quoted line this time of year saying it's the most wonderful time of the year. Yes, we're talking about transfer portal season and what BYU is going to do as they go portaling.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first view and or listen of the day. And as always, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and if it hits, you get $150 in bonus bets courtesy of your friends at FanDuel. Check out FanDuel.com to get started today. All right, let's talk BYU and the transfer portal. The transfer portal officially opened yesterday. Now, news started trickling about guys announcing they were going to enter the portal last week. BYU had a handful of those guys, consider guys like Micah Harper, Jackson Bowers, etc. And those were, I don't necessarily think the most surprising, because when guys get buried on the depth chart and are obviously getting towards the end of their careers, in the case of a guy like Micah Harper in particular, and wants to find an opportunity to play out the rest of his college career in terms of actually playing on the field, I can understand why some of those guys decide to transfer. The first big surprise addition to the transfer portal for BYU, I think, came yesterday, and that is officially that Crew Wakley has entered the NCAA transfer portal from BYU. On its head, it is a major question mark to me as to why a guy who was a starter this year for BYU at safety, at the strong safety position, why he would enter the portal at this juncture. He's got 1 year left of eligibility, and he was, once again, a starter. Now, that waffled a little bit due to some injuries as the season progressed for him, but I still consider him to be one of BYU's best safeties on their roster. So it begs the question, why do you enter the transfer portal? I think it's probably a power play, quite honestly. And I can't speak for Crew, but I would imagine a guy who was a walk-on with the BYU football program, who has outperformed guys who are on scholarship, etc., may essentially be looking at this saying, you know what, I'm going to force my hand. If BYU wants me to stay here, they'll reward me, with a scholarship. And obviously he could cash in on NIL with the fact that he's played at a very high level for 2 seasons at the Power 4 level. So if Crew is intent on leaving BYU, wish him the best and say thank you for everything you did for the program. I thought he was a very, very solid player, if not a standout in multiple circumstances during his time at BYU. What does that mean for BYU, just looking bigger picture at the portal? Well, here's the deal with BYU. BYU, I think, is one of the atypical schools when it comes to the transfer portal. Yes, there are always going to be young men in the BYU football program who are going to opt to look elsewhere. Kalani Sitake has mentioned it multiple times when he's talked about the transfer portal, saying that he knows that BYU is not for everybody. There are going to be young men who are going to arrive on campus in Provo and quickly realize, you know what, I'm a fish out of water here. This is not meant for me. And Kalani has made it very clear that he will do everything, everything within his power to help those young men have a successful college career, even if it's not as a member of BYU and going to Brigham Young University. And I can respect the fact that he's looking out for the players. Kalani is a former player himself. In his era, the transfer portal was not a thing. You simply just did not really leave unless you had some crazy circumstance play out. In this era, guess what? It's a normal thing, and it's going to be part of the equation. But I do believe the fact that BYU, being a church-affiliated school, they are going to, I think, and this is just me projecting onto BYU, to be very honest about it, but I believe that BYU is one of those schools out there that might be more portal-proof than many other universities. What does that mean? BYU has a unique mission. We all know this. It's a church-affiliated university, obviously affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because of what BYU stands for, what they look for in terms of the players that join this program, I think the vast majority of BYU football players are content to stay put in Provo. Let's say if a coach were to leave BYU, that would probably lead to a mass portal exodus. But considering Kalani Sitake just got a long-term extension that I believe will take him into the 2030s, there is long-term stability with the BYU football program. And that should indicate to any players questioning what their future is with BYU to say, you know what? Coach is here for a long time. This is what BYU stands for. This is how BYU operates. I'm going to stand by what BYU has brought to me in my life and going to do right by myself and stick around in Provo. I can't speak for every player, the 122 players on the roster that was last released by BYU. Not all 122 of them thought it was the place for them because we've seen a handful of guys enter the portal. But relative to some other programs out there, BYU has been hit very lightly by the portal. Yes, there was a decent sized senior class, and a lot of those guys are moving on. A lot of them looking obviously to to professional football, particularly the NFL, if it comes calling for them. But I think the other point is that BYU, by the very nature of what this program is all about, who it represents, what they espouse to accomplish inside the program, I think it's a university that if a young man picks BYU to begin with, I think for the most part, they understand what they're getting into. And more importantly, Kalani Sitake and his staff have proven once guys show up in Provo, if they embrace what BYU is all about, well, BYU embraces them right back, and it becomes a very fruitful relationship. So that's where I kind of get the gist. I believe that BYU, amidst the 134, if I recall correctly, other FBS universities out there, BYU is one of the few that I believe on an annual basis may take less hits with regards to the transfer portal than other programs. There are simply going to be programs out there that are going to be transfer portal in and out. That's just part of how things are going to go. And especially at the G5 level with guys, if they stand out at that level, the Power 4 programs, BYU among them, will reach down, say, hey, we've got X amount of money via NIL or the new revenue sharing that's going to come into effect next year. Here's what we're offering you. Do you want to come up and play at this level? That's going to be a simple fact of life until things change, but it doesn't appear that anything's going to change on that front for the foreseeable future. So I look at it and saying that BYU, they are a university that is going to, I think, be able to absorb some of the hits the transfer portal takes and just kind of move along because, once again, I believe most of the guys who ultimately pick BYU, whether it is out of high school, junior college, transfer portal, however they arrive in Provo, by and large, they understand what BYU can do for them, and BYU in turn can live up to those expectations of those young men. And I hope that every one of them has a positive impact in what is really a wild world out there. Yes, there are guys, I think like a guy like Crew Wakley, who may be pushing the envelope a little bit, saying, you know what? I've outperformed what was expected of me as a former walk-on with this program, and I'm going to try and cash in on that, as they should. Any young man who wants to get a sense of what he's worth, I would say if you want to get a sense, throw your name in the transfer portal, see what bites you get out there, to use the fishing example, and then evaluate and ultimately determine what your future is going to be. Now, could that put you in limbo with the program you are, quote unquote, going to leave? Yes, it absolutely could, because it could alienate you from the coaching staff. It could alienate you from your teammates and the like. But it's a very dog-eat-dog world out there in the transfer portal, and we all know it. It's kind of the seedy underbelly of all this, is that we've got agents, high school coaches, etc., who are working behind the scenes. Even when a young man's not in the portal, they are hearing from people around them saying, hey, if you hop in the portal, you're worth X amount of money, and this university is willing to pay that for you. It is going to get bigger and more crazy than it already is. And we already saw a record, I think by midday, lunchtime, Eastern time yesterday, it was already a record for the amount of players who had entered the portal. And guess what? The portal opened at, I think, midnight Eastern time. So in just 12 hours, I think it was something north of 550 different players. This is a year, by the way, also with the roster cut downs that are going to be implemented from 123 to 105 man rosters. You could see a record just simply due to the fact the amount of bodies that programs are going to have to cut down that could enter the portal. And the sad part is there's not going to be landing spots for everybody at the level that they hope to play at. Some guys at the Power 4 will have to drop to the G5, G5 down to FCS, FCS down to D2, D2 to D3, D3 to NAI. It's going to be just kind of a cascading effect on all divisions of football. And it's a wild world out there when it comes to the transfer portal. But once again, I'll reiterate, I do believe that BYU, by simply the very nature of what BYU is all about, is going to be one of the few universities I think that can withstand everything going on in the portal and still come out maybe not completely unscathed, but let's be honest, they're not going to take as many hits as other programs out there will take, just by the very nature of what BYU is all about. Now, that brings the question, What is BYU looking for in the portal? Well, I've got some theories and I've got some, intel, I should say, of what I think BYU is looking for as they hit the transfer portal. We've already seen it with regards to some of the offers they've already extended in the early goings of the transfer portal, and we'll delve into that momentarily right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Now, FanDuel is here for you guys to have fun and tackle the NFL action all season long because FanDuel is once again America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. It's as simple as that. So the FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything to place your live bets on the NFL or really any other sport that you're interested in, all in one place. So you get the hunch in the middle of a game. You can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets. You always have the up-to-date information to make sure you're not placing a bad bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started once again with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet hits. It's as simple as that. Go to FanDuel.com to get started. Once again, never waste a hunch and make every moment more with our friends at FanDuel, as they are an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first view and or listen of the day. Jake Hatch along for the ride here on this Tuesday. And the get up here, you probably have watched this on YouTube saying, Jake, we're wearing a collared shirt. I was at the John Watson Northern Utah High School Football Player of the Week awards banquet last night. And I will just say this on the recruiting front. The state of Utah is pumping out an incredible amount of talent. The 2025 class is stacked, but the 2026 class in the state of Utah might outdo it by leaps and bounds. There is a lot of good football being played in the state, and Utah is just one small slice of it. I'm going to be at a banquet tomorrow for Utah County, Thursday for Salt Lake County, and I can tell you, just talking and interacting with these young men, there's some really good football players, ballers, as some like to call them, around this state, and I hope that BYU can just start to reel in some of those guys via the high school ranks. Well, also, BYU is obviously going to be looking for additions via the transfer portal. Now, the transfer portal, as I just mentioned, is a wild world. In the era now of NIL, collectives, and obviously the implementation of a salary cap, for lack of a better term, revenue sharing that's coming into effect next year. There is more money on the table than there ever has been for college athletes. And obviously that's going to entice young men to look at their options. There are certain positions out there in the portal world that are at a premium. Obviously, quarterback. Quarterback play at the college football level can elevate your program from mediocre to good, from good to great, if you can get the right guy in the program. The nice part is, as it stands right now for BYU, they don't need to look at a portal quarterback in this circumstance because Jake Retzloff has gotten 10-2 this past season as BYU starting quarterback and appears to be intact and ready to rock and roll for another year as BYU's signal caller. So what positions really does BYU need to target, and what is it going to cost them to get guys into this program? Well, I think there are 4 position groups, in my opinion, that BYU needs to target most of all in the transfer portal. Now, the right player, a game changer at any position comes available, BYU would be dumb to not kick the tires on any and all options out there. If a young man has interest in BYU and they are the type of talent you believe that can impact your program, you bring them in regardless of talent. It's kind of the best player available philosophy when it comes to the NFL draft. You get the best players and put them in position to succeed and hope it pans out on the football field. But outside of that, there are 4 position groups BYU needs to look at most of all. I believe number 1, and maybe the most expensive outside of quarterbacks, is offensive line, in particular, offensive tackle. Caleb Etienne was just named All Big 12 first team. He is going to make it BYU offensive tackle university because they're going to go 4 for the last 4 at left tackle being drafted in the NFL. Braden Keim, his bookend mate at right tackle, very likely could hear his name in the NFL draft, or if not, he will get opportunities at the NFL level via the preferred free agent route because he's a very capable player in his own right. Our good friend Connor Pay, who we're expecting to have on the podcast later this week, he likely gets an NFL opportunity. Offensive linemen, particularly offensive tackles, may be the second most lucrative position in the transfer portal market, and they'd be kind of dueling with maybe defensive ends, pass rusher types at that number 2 spot behind quarterbacks. BYU needs to find offensive tackle talent, if not outright depth, in this transfer portal cycle. That is going to cost them a pretty penny to find the right guys. Obviously, a guy like Andrew Gentry, who BYU pursued out of high school, pursued after his mission, who ultimately has spent time most recently with Michigan, obviously, after enrolling there. Well, he could be a guy BYU targets for a third time. Can they take a third bite at the apple? And maybe this time he picks BYU. He would be a welcome addition for just simply depth's sake at right tackle or offensive tackle in general for BYU. But what's going to cost? Because once again, offensive line talent, there's a dearth of it in the transfer portal, and impact offensive linemen, they can make quite a bit of money. And that is going to be the interesting part about this. How much money does BYU and Dave George, as the new general manager, how much do they allocate for talent acquisition in the transfer portal, and especially at offensive line? So offensive tackle and offensive line in particular, BYU needs to find some guys at that position group. Opposite them on the defensive line, defensive tackle absolutely needs to be BYU's focus. John Nelson, Blake Mangelson were absolutely awesome for BYU defensive tackle. Behind them, there are question marks about the overall depth and talent base BYU has at defensive tackle. I love guys like Josh Singh. I loved what David Latu showed in spurts. John Tamoya-Payao. Are they going to be the guys who can really lead this program forward? Or can you go out in the portal and find guys who can come in and be the impact players you need them to be? It's a big question mark here because I believe BYU needed to go to the transfer portal last year for defensive tackle. They opted for continuity. John Nelson and Blake Mangelson answer the bell and were absolutely lights out. Maybe they continue to follow that philosophy and hope it pans out once again. Lightning strikes twice. We'll see. But I believe defensive tackle, if not overall defensive line play. If you can find an impact pass rusher, BYU still needs to be able to get more sacks and generate more of a pass rush. Can you find a guy of that caliber? So once again, offensive line and defensive line are going to be but important positions for BYU to target in the transfer portal. Up next, cornerback in the defensive backfield. We'll use guys like Mark Collins and Jacob Robinson. Well, all of a sudden there is an absolute empty kind of chasm for BYU at cornerback. Could young players like Trey Alexander, a guy like Marcus McKenzie potentially coming off an injury marred a couple of seasons, could they emerge and become BYU starting corners? Easily, they could do that. But I think at the same time, when you lose top-tier talent at a position like BYU did with cornerback, you have to hit the transfer portal market just to find out what you have out there. I'm sure that Gennaro Guilford has been meticulous in looking at all the options that are available at cornerback and will continue to do so. And hopefully BYU can find some guys there, if not an outright starter, who can come in and essentially assume that number one cornerback role. If they can find that type of a guy, it's going to cost you once again, because that's just the simple fact of doing business in this era of college football. But cornerback absolutely needs to be looked at by BYU. And then the fourth position I believe BYU needs to look at is tight end. A lot of y'all out there have been saying that BYU doesn't ever target their tight ends. The offense is not built for it. My counter to that, and I said it on social media this week with a good friend of the podcast, is that if you look at the career of Isaac Rex, if you have an impact tight end in Aaron Roderick's system, they will get the ball. That is just, there's no doubt about it. BYU's tight ends this year, really, did any one of them stand out above all the others? Not really. Mata'ava Ta'ase, Keanu Hill, Ethan Erickson, Reiner Swanson. You look at all the different guys, not one of them really separated themselves and became an Isaac Rex type of tight end. Can BYU find one of those guys in the transfer portal? We all know the tight end has been a keen part of BYU's success going back literally decades. Wide receivers are absolutely something BYU needs, and they've had a very good run of having good wide receiver talent because Kalani Sitake is just absolutely lights out at finding talent at that position. So obviously there's going to be extra balls going the way of the wide receivers. But if you can find a tight end that is worth getting the ball to in multiple circumstances, get them in here, get them installed, and let them take over, because they're, once again, similar to cornerback. There's a lot of guys leaving that tight end unit, and a guy that I would think would step up into that role, but he's going on a mission, is Reiner Swanson. So you're losing three guys to eligibility expiring or graduation, and then obviously a guy like Reiner Swanson going on a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Well, all of a sudden, tight end looks like a position that you could say, hey, you want to come in and make an impact? You want to be an impact player? Here's the opportunity to do that. So tight end, I believe, is another position group BYU needs to target. But I would say I just laid them out in priority of how I would go about it. Number 1, offensive line. Number 2, defensive line. Number 3, cornerback. Number 4, tight end. And beyond that, if you can find an impact wide receiver, a standout safety to maybe replace Crew Wakley, even though you have a lot of talent and a lot of bodies at that safety spot already. If you can find the type of guys that can come in and be the type of players BYU needs them to be, then great. Bring them in, set them up to succeed, and see what happens. But until I get a better feel for how BYU is going to approach this portal and how they want to go about finding guys, it's going to be an interesting world out there. How willing to play ball is BYU in the transfer portal cycle? Well, we've seen them be willing to play ball when it comes to college basketball recruiting. Can that be the same philosophy when it comes to BYU football? That is a big question I still think needs to be answered fully, and maybe we will never really get a full answer on it, but maybe at some point we will. Other part about it, once again, with roster cutdowns coming down, Aaron Roderick essentially said it last week. BYU carried 6 quarterbacks this past year. They plan to carry 4 next year. Well, guess what? Only one's leaving. Gary Bohannon, I can confirm this, is leaving the program. He's not going to be around. I know he didn't walk on senior day, but he is out of eligibility. So you have 5 guys currently on the roster at quarterback. Who are the odd men out? Could a guy like Isaac Wilson still factor in? I know there's interest, at least on the base level, from BYU and a guy like Isaac Wilson, obviously due to his ties via his older brother with BYU. But who do you ace out? Who are the 2 quarterbacks maybe leave to make room for a guy like Isaac Wilson to join the fray? A lot of unanswered questions, and I don't frankly understand how things are going to go here to find out how BYU is going to do this. But it's going to be very curious to track it all, and obviously we'll be talking a lot about it here on the podcast. All right, the final thing about portal in season for BYU. What is the philosophy? What should BYU's philosophy be? I know that Kalani Sitake has addressed this. Jay Hill has addressed it. Aaron Roderick has addressed it. But what should BYU's overall philosophy be for success, I believe, at the Power 4 level when it comes to the portal? We'll delve into that as we wrap up this edition of Locked On Cougars next. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Omaha Steaks. Now, nothing delivers comfort and joy like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks, my friends. It's guaranteed perfection in every single bite. And right now, you can save on unforgettable gifts with 50% off site-wide at omahasteaks.com. Plus, score an extra $30 off with the promo code COLLEGE. Let me reiterate that. 50% off site-wide. That's to start with. So half off plus another $30 off with promo code COLLEGE via our friends at Omaha Steaks. With 5 generations of experience, Omaha Steaks consistently delivers the world's best steak experience, and the gifting experts at Omaha Steaks have made it easier to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages featuring gourmet favorites. The best part is, from legendary steaks to mouthwatering desserts and more, save 50% off site-wide once again for a limited time at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners, once again, an extra $30 off with the promo code COLLEGE. That's 50% off at OMAHA. That's omahasteaks.com, and an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. Of course, minimum purchases may apply, but once again, get started today by going to omahasteaks.com. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first view and or listen of the day. If you want the inside scoop on all things I'm hearing on BYU, make sure to join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. There's a link in the show notes below, whether you're watching this on YouTube or wherever you're listening via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the like. Check it out. 14-day free trial, $5 a month to get the inside scoop on all things BYU sports. And join us today on the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. All right. Before we go on today's show, let's talk about what I believe BYU's philosophy should be when it comes to the transfer portal for the long-term future. Now, Kalani Sitake has talked about this. Aaron Roderick, Jay Hill have already addressed it. They're always going to use the transfer portal, obviously, to fill cracks with regards to maybe guys not panning out that they recruited into the program. Or if you have guys suddenly depart the program via the transfer portal, all lost surprise losses like a Crew Wakley, for example. How do you go about papering that over? Well, the transfer portal is the great delineator there. Can you find the right type of guy to come in and fill in that gap, whether it's for 1, 2, 3, or 4 years? That's the big question of how long they have eligibility-wise via the transfer portal. I believe BYU should and will remain a developmental program. And what that is, they're going to rely a lot on bringing high school guys into the program and spend 2 or 3 years building them up via redshirt and obviously being backups to being top shelf players that can be essentially maybe a 3-star prospect coming into the program, but end up producing at a 4-star level. That's the way BYU has had success for generations, and I think it needs to continue to be their philosophy overall. I believe BYU also needs to use the transfer portal once again to fill in cracks where things may fall short. Maybe you bring in a guy who's a 3-star talent, he ends up being a 2-star production guy. Well, guess what? That is a miss, and you have to be able to fill that in. That is where the transfer portal needs to be implemented for BYU. I think BYU learned a hard lesson year one in the Big 12 when they turned over that roster, the tune of, I think it was like 63 or 65 players of the 123 man were brand new to the program, and a lot of them were transfer portal guys. BYU leaned heavy into the portal, thinking it might help them build up adequate quality Big 12 depth in a very quick order. It never really materialized to that level. And in fact, I think at BYU, we've heard from multiple players say that they never really gelled as a team that year. And obviously that contributed to a 5-7 season. They bet on more continuity last year coming into the season and were rewarded with a 10-2 campaign. So I think the lessons BYU has learned so far at the Power 4 level, especially when it comes to the transfer portal, is that BYU, unlike some other programs out there, let's look at the Oregons, the Ohio States, where they can essentially buy the top shelf talent. They just have an unlimited checkbook. Phil Knight has opened the checkbook to such a level at Oregon that literally anybody who wants to make a bevy of money and is deemed worthy of going to Oregon can essentially name their price, and Oregon will essentially pay it. It is incredible, the stories I hear about Oregon and what they're doing with NIL. Outside of them, maybe Ohio State, Michigan to the same level, like those top tier programs where, like I said, that the pocketbook just doesn't run dry. BYU is going to have to be kind of the opposite of that, where yes, they can compete on an NIL level with certain players, and obviously they will do that because there's a certain guy announcing at 8:30 Mountain Time in basketball that BYU's in the mix for, and NIL is going to play a key role in this. But BYU, yes, they can compete, I think, for in certain circumstances, guys, but maybe not all the guys out there. And that's where I think BYU should use the transfer portal judiciously. We all know that BYU is unique. I already talked about that earlier this year, where I think the transfer portal doesn't hit BYU as hard as other programs simply due to the nature of what BYU is all about and the way that the program conducts its business. Well, conversely, when it comes to transfer portal guys, why are they in the portal to begin with? Were they a malcontent at their former university, the program they were a member of? Or are they guys who just simply won't fit in at BYU because, once again, of the unique nature of what Brigham Young University entails academically, spiritually, and obviously athletically? You got to find the right fits of guys coming into Provo and coming to BYU. And we talk about BYU being a special place. It's unique. It is absolutely unique. Provo is a unique ecosystem and environment for college student athletes. So BYU has to, I think, straddle a line here where I believe that the overall philosophy is, yes, bring in 3-star guys and get 4 or 5-star talent production out of them down the line by working with them and developing them and hopefully retaining them even when some of those big dogs may come calling with big checks in the NIL world. But also, at the same time, don't be afraid if you're BYU to go out and find guys in the portal. If you can find the right fit, like I said, a guy who fits in with what BYU entails as an athlete, because it entails more than just pay for play, which is what we've kind of adapted to with this NIL world. But more importantly, if BYU can find guys who want to come in, represent BYU in the right fashion, and more importantly, have a major impact on BYU winning football games, great. Bring them all in, and let's see what happens. I think Kalani Sitake has got a really, really good grasp of what BYU needs to do in this new era when it comes to college football. Now, that could change as soon as it feels like tomorrow with regards to he could have a great plan today, and it could be outdated tomorrow. But the one thing I have learned about Kalani in his now nearly decade-long tenure at BYU is he will adapt and morph as needed to fit what BYU entails. Yes, BYU, that obviously that uniqueness about the university, it may entail where BYU has to slow play some stuff in terms of maybe saying, okay, we can't maybe adapt as quickly as some other programs with regards to academics requirements and getting guys enrolled in school. Okay, that's part of the cycle when it comes to what BYU is trying to do. But I also think at the same time, BYU understands what it's all about, and they're not going to sacrifice what makes it unique just simply in the name of trying to win football games. Winning football games, yes, BYU's all about that. Any of us that talk about BYU, you guys watching this podcast, you want nothing more than to see BYU win football games. But I also think at the same time, BYU has a good sense of what BYU stands for, and they're not going to sacrifice their, I guess, morals is probably the right term, in the pursuit of that winning. If the winning comes a result of sticking up for their morals, great. And I think that's really what they've done so far. And this 10-2 campaign so far has been evidence of that. But at the same time, once again, BYU will not cross themselves up and put themselves in a bad situation simply to go out there and have maybe the most gaudy roster in all of college football. Because let's be honest, once again, if Oregon has an unlimited checkbook from a multi-billionaire and a guy like Phil Knight, yes, I know BYU has billionaire donors, but I don't think they're necessarily as willing to open up that checkbook and essentially hand a blank check to Kalani Sitake. At least at this juncture, the BYU, they're going to have to be a little more judicious. And I think the philosophy is still be a developmental program, but at the same time, use that transfer portal to find the right guys that can come in and make a major impact as a member of the BYU Cougars. All right. Hopefully that all made sense. Hopefully that makes a lot of what you're thinking and feeling about the transfer portal cleared up a little bit, but there are a lot of names out there. Carson Ryan, Isaac Wilson from Utah. I look at Andrew Gentry from Michigan. There is a lot. I mean, a lot of guys who have connections to Utah and obviously the state. I'm speaking of Utah and BYU that could obviously be transfer portal candidates. There's other guys out there who have no connection to BYU right now that may end up becoming fan favorites. I think Darius Lassiter is the poster child for that. Comes in from Eastern Michigan, was a relative unknown, and has become just an absolute sensation in Provo. Could that happen once again for BYU? I sincerely hope so, and it's going to take some time for that to play out. But the transfer portal, it's just really kind of getting spinning here. And that carousel, it is not slowing down anytime soon. All right, that is going to do it for today's edition of the show. Once again, coming up later this week, we're reacting to AJ DeBonce's decision, whatever it may be. We'll also catch up with Connor Pay, talk about Kalani Sitake's extension with him, also playing Colorado in the bowl game, what he envisions for his final football game as a BYU Cougar. There's a lot to talk about and a lot to cover ahead this week on the podcast, so stay with us every single day. And once again, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first view and or listen to the day. And as always, thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.